Hello, class, and welcome to Module 2. This week we're going to be talking about the Apache configuration, how to enable different modules, and what TLS is and how do we enable it inside of Apache. Now, some of our learning objectives for this is obviously we're going to have to go through the configuration file layout itself. We're also going to have to explain the difference between sites enabled and sites available, which are two different features in Apache. We're also going to have to talk about enabling and disabling Apache modules safely and how you can go about doing so. And then finally, we'll talk about HTTPS and HTTP2 on Apache. So, what have we done so far? Well, we've learned the basics of HTTP fundamentals and a little bit about Apache Webserver, but we need to get a little bit deeper and talk more about the configuration of how we can change different features in Apache, as well as how do we enable encryption for traffic with TLS encryption. Now, why does configuration structure matter? Well, production servers have to be safely modified. You can't end up disabling or breaking a feature and causing a lot of loss of money for your company. And that's not very good. So often you want changes to be reversible. If something goes wrong, you should be able to fix it pretty immediately. And you try to want to make your features modular. And that's one of the things about the configuration file and different configurations is that you can actually make it very modular this way. And that's how Apache is actually centered around these design principles. Now, in the Apache configuration file, there's several different things that you need to take into consideration when you're looking at it. The main configuration file is apache2.conf. And if you ever work with this, you should always make sure that you take a copy of it. You don't want to accidentally delete something that's important and then you end up having to start from scratch after you broke the website. The next one that's pretty important that you'll work with is ports.conf. And this is actually where listening ports are stored. And this is really important because some features, especially when we work with Squid, you can't end up having Apache use port 80. You have to instruct it to use other ports because Squid and other reverse proxies often are going to use that HTTP port. And if you know anything about port protocols, you can only have one thing being resolved to that port. You can't have multiple things going through there. Otherwise, you'll have network conflicts. And this is kind of where sites enabled versus sites available come from. So there's two different things you have to look at when you look at Apache. One of them is sites available, which just shows the different sites that you have built into your configuration for Apache versus sites enabled, which is what's actually running. Now, the nice thing about Apache and many web servers is that they can run multiple web servers inside of one. So you can have multiple websites running from one web server. And this is a way not only to maximize the usage of your server, but also to minimize the space that it takes in your configuration. And by enabling certain sites with sites enabled, you're able to say, okay, I want to use these different web pages and serve them for my users. But in case I need them, I can still have these sites that are in the backup for me with sites available. This is kind of similar to mods available and mods enabled. Now, with mods available, you end up can see which different modules are actually available to you in Apache. There's a bunch of different features that Apache has, but not all of them are turned on by default. Now, this is because if you ended up having every feature turned on, it'd be very bloated. We don't want that. But also, there's certain base services that are going to be in all configurations. And some of them that are very often used are things like HTTP2 or things for security, which can be implemented across systems. And a lot of times you'll see people using a lot of the same modules, even if they're not enabled by default. Now, included in the base configuration model is enabled sites and modules, and this includes optional directives. You should avoid editing a single monolithic config file. You don't want to do this. Instead, you want to have other directives that you can use and instruct Apache, such as sites enabled and sites available. If we remember, we talked about that in the last slide. Now, with sites available, like I said, we went over it a little bit, but it's only the definition. Like I said, just keep that in mind. Versus sites enabled, that's actually what's working. And you can end up doing this with the A2 end site and the A2 disk site activation commands that we have. You'll see that we'll use this a lot, especially at the ends of the modules. We'll end up turning off and on different features. And this is so that we can have a clean workspace or make it so that we don't have conflict since a lot of these use the exact same ports. And this is the same thing for disk site. We'll turn them off, just the opposite of each other. And this is to prevent accidental outages too. So because you have to deliberately declare from the configuration file which site you actively want from your site's available file, it makes it so that you can prevent these outages. You don't accidentally take down a bunch of people's sites because you only work with what's your site that you have. And this is where the idea of virtual hosts come in from Apache. So this makes it so that you can have multiple sites on one IP. Why do we want this? Well, one, it saves space. It makes it a lot better, but it also makes it so that routing can be done based on host headers, and you can make it a lot more optimized for your overall infrastructure, especially if you're a company running many subservers. It makes it a lot easier so you don't have to have multiple servers all to run Apache. Now, the default site is used when no hostname matches. So you'll end up getting, normally that will be your index or your default config page that you end up having for there. And this is normally the base site that Apache has enabled. Now, if you end up disabling the default site, it'll end up going to whichever one you have enabled. So just keep that in mind. It's going to default back to that if it doesn't match any other host names. And this kind of brings us into the modules. Now, we're not going to go over all the modules in this lab. There's other features we're going to go over, and during the midterm for the midterm project, you will be going over a couple more Apache modules. But for now, we'll be working with HTTP2, and a few other examples are SSL, headers, proxies, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the next module. And they're only are loaded when enabled. Just keep that in mind that it's not going to come on there unless you build it on there. It's a lot like how you can end up building Linux to have certain features and modules enabled. Now, in order to manage it, it's a lot like managing the sites. You can use the a2nmod command and the a2dismod command in order to enable and disable modules. And this makes it so that you don't actually have to edit the core configuration file, which is a lot better for your overall practices of deploying your web server. And Apache CTL-M will show the loaded modules just so you can look at this and actually see which ones are enabled on your system. Now, why is HTTPS required? That's probably what you're asking. We've seen HTTPS at the front of our websites, and we might have wondered this, why is HTTPS here? We've seen HTTP. Well, if you remember, there's different features baked in from our prior module where we talked about HTTP. And one of the biggest shortcomings of HTTP, besides not being multiplexed, is the fact that HTTP does not have encryption for data. It's in plain text. And that's very bad because people can intercept that and they get passwords, banking information, all sorts of bad things. So they moved away from that very quickly. And this is where HTTPS came in because it introduced TLS encryption. And TLS encryption made it so that you ended up having, when data was transmitted, it was encrypted and it used. At that time, it was the latest form of encryption. But now we're up to TLS 1.3, which is baked into HTTP 3, if you remember, by default. So it ends up removing a lot of that overhead from the application layer. But for now, we're going to work by implementing HTTPS because in order to run HTTP 2, we have to have that encryption for it to run and able to establish a fully secure session that we're able to use. And this is also required to use HTTP2 in the browser. So when you enable HTTP2, especially if you enforce it, you have to use that protocol, otherwise it won't work because HTTP and HTTPS use two different ports. HTTP uses port 80 and HTTPS uses port 443. So there are two different ports that they use as well for functionality. And the certificate's going to actually verify the server's identity of them saying that they are who they say they are. Now, this is where the idea of self-signed versus signed certificates comes into play. Now, self-signed certificates is typically used for learning or internal testing. Sometimes you might play around with it in your own environment that you have, but typically they're not going to be trusted by the browser, and that's where you're going to get the error that this is a suspicious link, or you might end up have to click the advanced option and click proceed anyway, even though it says that it's insecure. But it still enables full TLS functionality. That's the big thing, is that we still can have that encryption even with the self-signed certificate or self-signed certificate. Now, The other side of this coin is signed certificates. Now, signed certificates, often you have to pay to have a signed certificate, and they're provided by a certificate authority. One such example is Amazon. AWS has its own certificate authority, so it's able to issue different certificates. And this provides the trusted by browsers as reliable, and you can see that lock up in the browser in the URL bar there when you end up seeing HTTPS with a signed certificate versus the ones we're going to be playing with. And often your company should have its own certificate or its own authority that's pulling certificates from. And you'll actually set these different values in, and that actually leads up to the next slide. So enabling SSL, you end up needing to have TLS support as well as having default-TSS or default-SSL.conf define HTTPS as vhost, which will make a little bit more sense in a minute after you do the lab. And this is going to actually outline the certificate path or where can I find my certificate that I created, as well as the key that'll be deciphering the encryption. And we're going to use OpenSSL. Another popular option is Let's Encrypt that you'll hear people talk about online. And with OpenSSL, it's an X509 certificate, which ends up making it a lot more secure than other types of certificates in the past. Now, it's a different type of file that if you look at it, it's going to be very jumbled. It's not human readable. And we're going to end up creating just a basic RSA 2048 key that we specify here. And we're going to specify that our module certification and key is going to be an etc Apache 2 /SSL and then /module 2. And the same is going to be, except we're going to name the certificate instead of the key as output for the other line as well. This is going to specify where our key and certificate actually live when we create it. And it's going to have you go through some information, fill it out, so if people pull a certificate, they can see when it was created, how long. You can see here we specified days, how long is it good for, and here we specified 1 year. But sometimes you might want to specify longer or shorter periods, depending on how your security policy actually is for your organization. And enabling HTTP2 is pretty simple. Besides having the directive inside your virtual host, it'll end up having to put this line protocols H2 HTTP /1.1 directive inside the block. If you remember editing that from before, you'll go to do that in the virtual host for your different sites in this lab. And it's going to end up making it so it's enabled. But besides doing that, you also have to enable the module with sudo a2nmod HTTP2. You have to do both those steps to get it. And this is actually going to be how HTTP2 is negotiated after TLS, and it actually works by implementing this. Now, in order to test this, we're going to look in our browser and we're going to use curl. Curl is going to be used extensively throughout this class, so get used to using it. But for our case, V actually verifies protocol negotiation when we use it, and the V-K actually bypasses self-signed certificates. So something you'll notice when we use HTTPS, if you have a self-signed certificate and you don't use the -VK option, it'll end up making it so that you'll end up getting an error that says it's a self-signed certificate. We're okay with that. We want to see, though, is it actually accepting the traffic? And it should say server accepted H2 when we end up getting the output. And some common misconceptions, just kind of wrapping up a lot of this, is that HTTP2 does not make a site work. You need HTTPS in order to have it be functional. And you have to actually have TLS must work before HTTP2. And the modules do nothing unless they're actually enabled and actually implemented properly. So something that we'll go over a little bit is just a couple of review questions that we have here. So this is just testing your understanding, just going through it a little bit, and we'll try having these moving forward at the ends of a lot of the lectures. So the first one is, what is the difference between HTTP and HTTPS? And I'll give you a second to go ahead and pause and think about that. So the main difference between the two is that HTTPS actually encrypts traffic, whereas HTTP is not encrypted and it's in plain text. And That leads us to our next one. What's the difference between HTTP 1.1 and HTTP 2? So the differences between the two is that HTTP 2 enabled true multiplexing, if you remember from our first lecture, and it made it so that it enabled more features overall versus HTTP 1.1. Now, the next question, what's the difference between sites enabled and sites available? So sites enabled is what sites are actually going to work. Sites available is what is actually available to serve from your web server. And this leads to our last question. What is the flag that's needed for curl with a self-signed certificate so that you don't get an error that it's a self-signed certificate? So the option that's correct is the -VK option. This is actually so you can bypass the self-signed certificate. So that's the end of the lecture for today. If you guys have any questions, just feel free to let me know and reach out, and I'll see you guys all in the lab.